agradecer el honor que me concedieron a tener que presentar al Lord Jonathan Sacks. Al igual que quiero agradecer a toda la gente que hizo posible esta serie de eventos con trabajo y dedicación. Jonathan Sacks es el rabino en jefe de la congregación hebrea de Commonwealth desde 1991, el sexto desde 1845. Antes de asumir su cargo actual, el rabino Sacks fue el director del Jewish College, al igual que el rabino de las sinagogas Golders Green y Marble Arch. Cursó estudios en los colegios de Gonville, en Caius, ubicados en Cambridge, donde se graduó con honores en filosofía, y cursó el posgrado en New College, Oxford. Obtuvo su PhD en King's College, Londres. Sus estudios rabínicos fueron en Jewish College y Yeshiva Etz Haim. Profesor visitante de varias universidades en Inglaterra, Estados Unidos e Israel. Tiene 15 títulos honorarios, incluyendo el de doctor en divinidad, conferido por el arzobispo de Canterbury. El rabino en jefe ha recibido numerosos premios y fue nombrado caballero por la reina en 2005, tomando su lugar en la Casa de los Lores el 27 de octubre del 2009, donde se sienta en crossbenches como el barón Sacks de Aldgate en la ciudad de Londres. Es contribuyente frecuente de la radio, televisión y de la prensa nacional inglesa y escribe artículos mensuales en la columna del Times. Publicó más de 24 libros, de los cuales obtuvieron numerosos premios. Nació en 1948 en Londres, está casado con Elaine desde 1970, tiene 3 hijos y 6 nietos. Por último, simplemente quiero agregar que Lord Jonathan Sacks es un pensador, filósofo, rabino, pero por sobre todas las cosas, una voz judía que nos trae la sabiduría de nuestro pueblo de una forma simple y contundente. A modo anecdótico, cuando en Alemania quisieron prohibir el Brit Milá, Jonathan Sacks se reunió con Merkel y logró revocar la decisión. Queremos agradecer una vez más, especialmente su visita a Uruguay, teniendo en cuenta su intensa agenda. Con nosotros, el rabino Lord Jonathan Sacks.
Thank you so much. And it's a great privilege to be with you in this extraordinary community. Elaine and I will never forget our visit here and your enthusiasm and your passion and your commitment. But I want tonight to talk about what it is to be a Jewish parent. And I want to begin with a little story, because we are just coming up to Pesach. And here is the story. Elaine and I were visiting one of our communities in Hong Kong many years ago. We came back late at night and I switched on the television and I saw a program on something called the Discovery Channel. Do you have that here? Yes. It's a kind of history sort of channel, yes? And they were showing a documentary about the great buildings of the Pharaoh of Egypt that many scholars believe is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Pharaoh Ramses II. Ramses II built great temples, and they still stand today more than 3,000 years later in Luxor, in Karnak, and in Abu Simbel. And the commentator was speaking in hushed tones, with admiration about these amazing buildings that have stood for 33 centuries. And for 10 minutes, I was really very impressed, until the thought struck me, who built those buildings? Our ancestors, yours and mine. And then I had a little thought in my mind. Suppose we could travel back in time, all those centuries, and actually meet Ramses II. And I imagined the following conversation. We come and we say, "O mighty emperor, I come to you from 33 centuries in the future, And I have some good news and some bad news for you. So he says whatever is the Egyptian for who is this Meshugana? And then, curious, he wants to know, okay, what is the good news? And you say the good news is that there is one people, one religion, alive today that will still be alive and well 33 centuries from now. And he says, what is the bad news? And you say, the bad news is it isn't going to be you. He says, so who is it? And you take him to the front of his temple and you say, you see those slaves in the distance? The ones called the Israelites, the ones you call the Hebrews, the Abiru, they are going to be alive and well 33 centuries from now. Can you imagine how mad, how crazy this would sound? In the days of Ramses II, Egypt dominated the whole of the Middle East and North Africa. Ramses II was worshipped as a god. He was the most powerful ruler ever of the longest-lived empire there has ever been in human history. The Egypt of the pharaohs was already 18 centuries old at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. It was an amazing thing. They built extraordinary things. Already long before Moshe Rabbeinu, they built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the one that still stands today, and that was the tallest man-made building until 1889, when they built the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So this was the greatest empire of the world. And on the other hand, what about the Hebrews, our ancestors? They were the lowest of the low. They were slaves, they had no rights, they had no freedom. And interestingly, we have a record of what the Egyptians thought about the Israelites. Because the earliest reference to Israel anywhere in the world, outside Tanakh, outside the Bible, is in a block of black granite that stands today in the museum in Cairo. I've never seen it, I've never been to Cairo. But it is called the Meneptah Stele. It is an engraving made by the successor to Ramses II, called Meneptah IV. And it contains these lines: Israel is laid waste, her seed, her children are no more. The first reference to Israel outside the Bible is an obituary. The Egyptians thought the Israelites were destroyed completely. So how was it that the great civilization of the pharaohs did not succeed? In fact, after Ramses II began to decline very radically, and the Jewish people survived? This was a good question. I'll tell you how I came on the answer. I am sometimes asked to do strange things as a chief rabbi. One of the strangest ones was writing speeches for President Bill Clinton. How did this happen? He was about to speak to a Jewish group, and he asked a rabbi in Washington to write a little speech for him. So Bill Clinton gave a Dvar Torah, written by a rabbi, to a Jewish group, and it went very well. So he said to the rabbi, do you think you could do me a few more of those? So the rabbi asked a few of his friends, including me, and I wrote some speeches for Bill Clinton, and this one in particular he loved and wrote me a most beautiful letter. And here is what I wrote to Bill Clinton. I said, this is the greatest moment for making a memorable speech ever. Imagine you are addressing not the American nation, but the Israelites who have been slaves, who have been in exile for 210 years. They have known slavery, and now you know that after a series of miracles, they're about to go free. You gather the nation. What do you talk about? You could talk about freedom, liberty, or you could make a great speech about the destination that lay ahead, the Eretz Zavat Chalav U'Dvash, the land flowing with milk and honey. Or if you were more serious, you could give them a speech about the difficult journey that lay ahead, what Nelson Mandela called the long walk to freedom. If you had made any of these speeches, there would be a great speech of a great leader. I didn't add then, maybe Steven Spielberg would make a film about you. Moshe Rabbeinu did none of those things, and that's what made him a unique leader. If you open the Chumash and you read the 12th and 13th chapters of the book of Shemot, Exodus chapters 12 and 13, you will read the speeches Moses gave on that occasion. 3 times he comes back to the same subject. V'haya ki yomru alechem b'neichem. When in the future your children say this to you, so you shall answer. V'haya ki yishalcha bincha macha. When your child asks you this, you shall answer that. V'higadata levincha bayom hahu. You shall teach your child on that day. 3 times he turns to the subject of parents as educators of their children. Why so? Because to defend an army, to defend a country, you need an army. But to defend a civilization, you need education. You need schools. You need study. And so, Jews became the people whose citadels were schools, whose heroes were teachers, and whose passion was study and the life of the mind. And above all, the people who said that parents must be educators. And that is what I wrote to President Clinton. And then I suddenly realized that I had answered the question I had when I was watching that documentary. How was it that Egypt didn't survive, but Israel did? Because Egypt and Israel asked the most fundamental question any of us can ask. How, in this brief lifetime that we have on earth, can we become immortal? How can we be sure that something of us will live on after us? And the Egyptians and the Israelites both answered that question, but in completely different ways. The Egyptians said you become immortal by building buildings that last forever. And you know what? The buildings did last, but not the civilization that gave rise to them. The Jews said no. To become immortal, you do not have to build buildings. You have to engrave your values on the hearts of your children, and they on their children, and so on across the generations. And that is how Jews survived, not by building dead memorials of brick and stone, but building living memorials of children who follow in our way. And I suddenly realized that that simple miracle is probably the greatest miracle in all of human history. We became eternal by teaching our children and teaching our children to teach their children. It's that simple. And so I want to tell you very briefly about how I was educated as a child. I want to tell you about my late father and my late mother were no longer alive, but to whom I and my brothers owe what we are. My father came to Britain as a refugee from Poland at the age of 6. His family was very poor, so he had to leave school at the age of 14, and he never had a real education. Not Jewish, not secular. My mother, of blessed memory, had to leave school at 16 because in those days, girls were not supposed to have an education. So they didn't know very much about Judaism. But they completely influenced my brothers and myself. There was an English magazine, political magazine, not a Jewish one, that asked me who were the most influential people in my life. And I said, my father, who would rather lose a friend than compromise a principle, and my mother, who kept all the friends my father lost. And somehow I want to share with you how they turned their 4 boys into boys who loved Judaism, one of whom became a chief rabbi, 2 of whom made Aliyah and are living now in Yerushalayim. First is a very interesting story. And I'm going to tell you it from the other way around. I try and spend time with our university students. And I remember a few years ago spending Shabbat with university students and telling them whoever had a question that they didn't want to ask in public, come and sit next to me and we will talk about it in private. Over that Shabbat, 5 different students with no relationship to one another came to me with a problem. I thought their problem would be drugs, or loneliness, or pressure. All 5 came to me with the same problem. I want to be religious, but my parents won't let me. Does that make sense to you? Can you imagine this? I want to keep kosher, but my parents won't let me. I want to keep Shabbat, but my parents won't let me. And I thought to myself, I never really realized this. But we were very blessed, my brothers and I. My parents didn't know much. They didn't keep much. But every time we learned something, and we learned a mitzvah that they didn't keep, and we started to keep it, they kept it with us. They encouraged us to grow. And every time we did something new, they did something new. And that was very beautiful. It was an enormous, enormous blessing. Secondly, I want to tell you something. We read in Shul today the parsha called Vayikra, which is all about sacrifices. The most remarkable thing you can give your children is the chance for them to see you making a sacrifice for something important. Let me give you an example. My father was very shy. It was an agony for him to talk to strangers. But he did something that I could almost not believe. He had a shul with very few people came to shul. It was an empty shul. So my father took it on himself to every night he would walk around our neighborhood. And when he would see a house with a mezuzah on, he would go up and knock on the door. And he would say, I see you have a mezuzah on your door. Are you by any chance Jewish? And if the person at the door said yes, he would say, oh, that's wonderful. He said, I don't know if you know this, we have a shul nearby, and I would be really honored if I could walk to shul with you next Shabbat. My father was a kind of kiruv worker, outreach worker, before anyone ever thought of this. This cost him enormous embarrassment. I used to really feel his pain. It took real courage to do this, but it made a huge impression on me. My mother used to make the Kiddush in shul every Shabbat. That made an impression on us. They were willing to give up some of their time and some of their life for the sake of the Jewish community. That was extraordinary. I saw you had my book there, Celebrating Life, in Spanish. I bet it sounds better in Spanish than in English. I tell the story there of a non-Jew, a very, very interesting man. There is a non-Jewish film producer in Britain called Richard Attenborough. He was the mad scientist in Jurassic Park, the one who makes Jurassic Park. He made a film called Gandhi, for which he won an Oscar. He's a very famous actor and producer, director in England. In 1939, the British saved 10,000 Jewish children from Germany. They brought them over on trains. It was called Kindertransport. In 1999, we made a big world gathering in London for some of the children of Kindertransport. We came together for the 60th anniversary from all over the world. And each one of them had a very emotional story to tell. But the story that had us all in tears was from a non-Jew, was from Richard Attenborough. And he told us the following story, that in 1939, when he was 13 years old, his father, who was the head of a non-Jewish school, called him and his two brothers into his study with his mother. And they said, children, we would like to adopt 2 Jewish children from Germany called Helga and Irene. But we won't do it unless you agree, because it will mean that we can afford less than we can now. Now we are a family of 5, we will become a family of 7, and we will have to share everything we have, including our love, because you have us, but they have no one. And the boys agreed, and they adopted those 2 girls. And Richard Attenborough, with tears in his eyes, said that was the most important day in his life. And I suddenly realized that the greatest gift we can give our children is to allow them to make a sacrifice, also in a great cause. That was the day that turned this man and his brother, who's equally famous, into great people, because their parents asked them to do something great, something difficult and something great. Don't think we do something good for our children by giving them a great deal. You know, the latest iPhone, or what's it called, your Samsung? Galaxy. The Galaxy 4 has just come out this week. Believe me, you give your children a lot of stuff, it only spoils them, because they didn't have to work for it. And you give them stuff they don't have to work for, you will spoil them for life. But give them a chance to give. That is very special. Then, the next thing I learned from my parents was even more peculiar, even more strange. I don't know, you're young, so you don't remember this. I'm ancient already. I go back to the Jurassic Age. There was a time before the Six-Day War, before 1967, when in England no Jew wore a yarmulke in the street. I mean, almost no Jews did it. Afterwards it became not unusual, but before then it was rare. And one day we were coming out of shul and I was wearing my yarmulke. I was a child. And a very nice person from Shul ran up to my father and pointed to my yarmulke and said, "Mr. Sachs, your son has forgotten to take his yarmulke off." And my father turned round to him and said with great passion, "No son of mine will ever be ashamed to be a Jew in public." And that moment changed my life. From then on, I was never afraid to wear my Jewish identity with pride. And that was something he taught me that was also very special. Then he taught us, and my mother taught us, the importance of high ideals. And here I'm going to give you a quite different story. We heard the following story in Britain about somebody we know. This somebody is a businessman who is very, very successful. He is actually very, very rich. And it came to the time of his son's bar mitzvah. And he is thinking to himself, what can I give my son as a bar mitzvah present? And this man gave his son the best bar mitzvah present I have ever heard of. He took his son, and the two of them went to a Jewish orphanage in Romania. And for 1 week, they lived with the orphans in conditions of great poverty. And at the end of the week, as they were going home, the son turned to the father and said, "Dad, do you think when I grow up, I will be able to help them the way that you help them?" And I thought to myself, that man knows how to bring up a child. Didn't give him anything expensive, but gave him something more valuable than anything you can buy. He gave him ideals. And then there is really the personal example. You know, do you remember that bit in the Haggadah? Rasha mahu omer ma'avodah zot lachem. I explained to you that I come from a family of 4 boys. So when it came to Pesach, I always hated that bit. I really hated it because echad chacha, ve'echad rasha, ve'echad tam, ve'echad she'enu yedei l'shol. Did I want any of my brothers to think I'm the rasha or he's the rasha? So I really hated this bit. And when I had a chance to write a Haggadah, a commentary to the Haggadah, I wrote the following thing about the Rasha, and we will not translate as the wicked child, but as the rebellious child. And I wanted to show that this rebellious child, you know, it's not crazy. Rasha mahu omer. What does the rebellious child ask? Ma avodah zot lachem. What does all this Judaism mean to you? Mom, Dad, I know what it's supposed to mean to me. After all, you hired me a teacher to teach me my bar mitzvah. You sent me to a Jewish school. The trouble was, when I went to the Jewish school and came back and said, I want to keep kosher, you got angry with me. When I said, I want to go to yeshiva in Israel before university, you said, my son, the fanatic. How come you're sending me mixed messages? You want me to be Jewish, but not too Jewish. What do you want? So don't tell me what you want Judaism to mean to me. I want to know what it means to you. Ma avodah zot lachem. And we have to be honest and say to our children what this really means to us. That has to be honest. And this I say about my parents. They may not have known much. They didn't always keep as much as they might because they didn't know. But one thing we never doubted, what ma avodah zot lachem, what Judaism meant to them. They loved it. They loved it. They were proud to be Jews. They were proud that their children were Jews. They loved it, and they communicated that love to us. The Alshich, a great commentator that we had, asked a very simple question. It says in the Shema, V'shinantam levenecha v'dibartam bam, you shall teach your children. And the Alshich says, how can the Torah command us to teach our children if it's not in our power to decide whether our children will follow in our ways or not? How can we be sure that we give our children our values? And he says, the answer to that is 2 verses earlier. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha v'chol modecha. If you want your children to follow in your way, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. If we love Judaism and our children know that, they too will love Judaism. That is very important. However, I want to end with the thing that really made the difference to me. When I used to be 5 years old, I used to walk back with my father from shul, and I would ask him many questions. Why do we say this? What does this mean? And he always gave me the same answer. He used to say, Jonathan, I didn't have a Jewish education, so I can't give you the answers to those questions. But one day, you will have the education that I didn't have. And when that happens, you will teach me the answers to those questions. You want your child to be a chief rabbi? That's how you do it. Can you imagine this, a 5-year-old child whose father is saying, one day you will become my teacher? I think that's a remarkable thing to say. And it was a great source of inspiration to me. And therefore it was one of the great moments of my life, 22 years ago, when my father, who was already over 80 years old, and had had, within a few years, 4 very serious operations, and he was only able to walk with sticks. And on September the 1st, 1991, he was sitting in the shul, and they gave him pticha, they gave him the mitzvah of opening the ark on the day that I was appointed chief rabbi. To me, that's the only reason we do anything, to give nachas to our parents. And all of that came from the fact that he wanted us to go on beyond it. Now, I want to say this loud and clear. If, God forbid, any of us fails with our children, none of us should feel guilty. Please remember that the first and greatest Jews of all, Abraham and Sarah, failed with one of their children, with Ishmael. Isaac and Rebekah failed with one of their children, with Esau. Moshe Rabbeinu failed with both his children. Neither of them became his successor. So if we fail sometimes with our children, let us not feel guilty. We say, Avinu Malkeinu, our Kadosh Baruch Hu is our parent. And I'll be honest, if Hashem is a parent, maybe he feels he failed with some of his children also. Let us not feel guilty. But I hope I've shown you how you give your children a love for Jewish identity which will lift them to the heights. There are 2 great figures in the Torah, Noah and Abraham. Noah and Abraham. Noah was great, but Abraham was greater still. And if you listen to the Torah, you will hear the difference. The Torah says about Noah, Et ha'elokim italech Noah. Noah walked with God. Noah waited for God to take a step, then he would take a step. Every time Hashem told him to do something, he did it. But every time Hashem didn't tell him to do something, he didn't do it. So he was great, but he was limited. When it came to Avraham, God said, Hitalech lefanai veyetamim. Go on ahead of me. I think the greatest, and that made Abraham. God gave him empowered him to go on ahead of him, not to wait for permission. Because our parents, my parents, said to us, Hitalech lefanai, go on ahead of us. We had so much Jewish education, very little. You go on and learn more than us. And give us pride. And to be able to do that to your children and let them be your teachers is probably the greatest blessing of all. Don't forget, we are the only people who hold that being a parent is the highest mitzvah of all. What does Avraham mean? The great parent. That's Av is father, and Ram means mighty. So Avraham was chosen because he was going to be a good parent. I'm sure every single one of you is not just a good parent, but a great parent. Encourage your children to go on ahead of you. And when they do, may you and all of us have pride. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a privilege to be here and to have the opportunity of listening to your thoughts. Thank you also for the organizers for this great meeting. Taking advantage that you are here, Rabbi may ask 2 questions instead of 1. Or probably more if we have time. The first, you have probably heard, you're here for a few days, that this community used to be larger than what it is right now. There are people say that there are several explanations for that. Probably one being that this community was conceived as a transition community. Many of us, all the time we think our mind is directed to foreign countries, to a foreign destination. And that's probably one of the main reasons we did not attempt to build here a community which would last. So the question is, sorry for taking so much time, the question is whether the goal of having our community, a Jewish community, a Uruguayan Jewish community, is a valid goal, a valid target for us, or it is irrelevant whether 20 or 30 years from now there will be even less Jews here than we are now. That's the first question. I don't know whether I can go into the second one. Okay. The second question is, Paul Johnson writes that Jews never learned how to live together political power with religion. And the question is what you believe should be the role of religion in the state of Israel.
Okay. Question 1, should you be building a strong, viable Jewish community in Uruguay? The answer is clearly yes. Because either way, if you bring up your children to be strongly committed Jews, then there are 3 possibilities. Either they will stay here and make this a strong community, or they will go to Israel and make Israel even stronger, or they will work for some multinational corporation and go, various places around the world. Hashem created Skype and what do you call it? FaceTime, especially for Jewish parents, because we always were a global people, we always were scattered around the world, and we tried to find ways of being connected. And Baruch Hashem, thanks to Skype and Facebook and FaceTime, we are. So, it doesn't matter at all whether Uruguay stays the same size or it grows or it gets a little bit smaller. It's still strong and it's viable, and assume that, and from every conceivable point of view, you have to make this a strong community. I held, and still hold, in Anglo-Jewry that we built a lot of Jewish schools in Anglo-Jewry. So for the first time we have in Anglo-Jewry a young generation that knows more than their parents, and is more committed than their parents. And people were saying to me, Chief Rabbi, you're a Zionist. What are you doing to maintain the Anglo-Jewish community? You should be encouraging all your kids to make Aliyah. And I used to say, we will make our kids strong Jews, and we will send them to study in Israel as well. And either way, either they will make Aliyah or they will stay in Britain and become, every one of them, a Shagrir Medinat Israel, an ambassador for the State of Israel. And the State of Israel right now in Europe needs many ambassadors because Europe has become very anti-Israel. And we train them to be ambassadors for Israel. As students, we teach them when they're 18 years old, we give them an ambassador's course, and they will become it. So one way or another, whatever the future holds in store, make this a strong Jewish community and assume it's going to be here. Maybe one day the spaceship will come down, courtesy of Hashem or Steven Spielberg, E.T., whatever, and we'll all go to Israel, but it makes no difference to the policy here. What is the place of religion in politics? I will tell you. They do not belong together. I put it very bluntly. Let's take religion out of politics, and let's take politics out of religion. It's that simple. And I am very insistent on this myself. I sit in the House of Lords. I have had the privilege of close friendships with 4 prime ministers, 2 conservative, 2 Labour. We have had the leaders of every political party in our home for dinner. We stay close to all the parties. Politics, the greatness of politics is that it deals with conflict. That's what it does. It says, don't massacre the opposition, just vote for your own party. Democracy takes the violence out of politics. But politics is essentially about conflict. Therefore, if any religious person or party get involved in politics, they become divisive. And religion should be a unifying force in Jewish life, not a divisive force. And it can only do so if it stays out of politics. So I don't know if you understood the introduction, but the introduction said that in the House of Lords I sit on the cross benches. That means I sit not as part of any party. Incidentally, they made the House of Lords like Yavne Minyan. There are only 250 seats and there's 750 lords, so you have to come early for Shachris if you want to sit. Next question? Somebody has a question. Chevra. Comes Pesach, you have to teach your children to ask questions. So you set them a good example. Can we have a question? Any question on anything? Except on my football team, which needs a refuah shlema. No, you had to already. We'll come back to you. Yeah.
How do you deal with marriage between non-Jews and Jews, which is something that is happening here in our community?
Well, we try, as far as we can, to bring our kids up in Jewish schools so they will meet other Jews. We try and encourage our kids to go to universities where there are large numbers of other Jews. We try and minimize the probabilities. If they meet a non-Jew and all the attempts to make that relationship fail don't work and they insist on it, then we will encourage them, please, 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 to come for the sake of your children, to build a Jewish home, for the non-Jewish partner to convert. And that's the only way we can deal with it. We have to minimize the risk. And you know, look, life was different when I was growing up. But I went to non-Jewish schools. We didn't have many Jewish schools. I went to Oxford and Cambridge, where the number of Jewish students wasn't great. So did my brothers, but the chance of our marrying out was zero, because our parents had shown us such love for Judaism. So you can't make sure it never happens. It happens, and we live with it, and we accept it. But you can minimize the risk. And that I think we have to do.
How the parents must deal with their kids. But now our kids are under big influence from other things, like TV, for example. Like in the school also, internet, Facebook, many things. Do we have to allow them to get into these things, or we have to try to cut the time?
I told a story the other day of a time that I made a television program for the BBC about drug addicts, actually, not Jewish ones. I did programs for non-Jews. And I went to a center that was curing 16 to 18-year-olds from drug addiction. And I said, I was filming the director of this rehabilitation center, and she was an angel. I mean, an angel dressed as a punk. Do you know that word? Punk. She had purple hair and a ring in her nose, but I realized that that was just a disguise, because really she was an angel. Because I asked her, what do you give these kids that allows them to break their drug addiction? And she said, we do two things for them. Number one, we are the first people they have met who give them unconditional love. And the second thing she said is, we are the first people they have met who care enough about them to say no. That was an extraordinary sentence. If you really care enough about someone and you see something's very dangerous, you have to care enough to say no. I think you have to be very careful what you expose kids to. I think you have to use parental controls on the internet. I think you have to be careful what you let them, what the kind of parties they go to, some of the friends they might make. If there's, I don't know whether you have a drug problem here in Uruguay. I know they have it in some other Latin American countries. And, you know, love does not mean allowing a kid to do what they like. Love means showing them the way. And if you do it with love, they will understand. It's when you just do it with authority, I say no, so it's no, and they don't feel the love, then they can rebel. But I think here the responsible thing is that there are certain influences that you know are going to be bad influences, and you have to love them enough to say no. No, I tell you what I did. This happened a long time ago. Sometimes you build up capital that you can use when you need it. I have been telling the European Union now for 10 years that we are beginning to have a very serious problem with anti-Semitism in Europe. In 2003, I persuaded, and some other leaders persuaded the European Union under its leader then, Romano Prodi, to hold a conference in the European Centre in Brussels. And I made a very strong speech about anti-Semitism. I got up and said, Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. It was a very strong speech. And it had some ripples. But 4 years passed and anti-Semitism was getting worse. And so I went, and this time this was not done in public, it was done in private. I met with the 3 leaders of Europe. Jose Manuel Barroso, who was head of the European Union, I think he still is. Hans-Gert Pöttering was head of the European Parliament at Strasbourg, and Angela Merkel, who was then chairing the European Union. And I gave them the following speech. This is the speech verbatim. It's a very short speech, and I'm standing facing all 3 of them. And I said, Jews and Europe go back a long way. And the experience of Jews in Europe added certain words to the human vocabulary. Words like expulsion, disputation, forced conversion, inquisition, auto-da-fe, ghetto, and pogrom. All words that entered the human vocabulary because of the way Jews were treated in Europe. And that is even without mentioning the word Holocaust. I said all of that is the past, and we can live with the past. But today the Jews of Europe are asking, is there a future for Jews in Europe? And that should concern you, the leaders of Europe. And I sat down. I don't think anyone had ever spoken to them that bluntly. But I felt the situation demanded no less. Angela Merkel then took me for lunch and said, what do you want me to do, Chief Rabbi? And I did not immediately have an answer. But when a court in Cologne a few months ago ruled that Brit Milah was illegal, I wrote Angela Merkel an open letter and said, you asked me 5 years ago, what can I do, Chief Rabbi? And I'm now going to give you the answer, overrule the court in Cologne, which thankfully, under great pressure, I'm not saying I made a difference, Shimon Peres also intervened, but she did do just that. And that court ruling has been overruled by the government of Germany. Friends, can I just end then by telling you a story? I mean, this is a ridiculously irrelevant story, but I just like the story. It happened to be one in which I was marginally. He used to go around auctions. Do you have auctions where people sell things? He used to go around auctions and buy old paintings. And he was kind of manic about it. He eventually acquired more than 500 old paintings. He could only hang a few of them on the walls. So he piled them up in piles and kept some of them in his chicken shed. There's a very odd man called Ernest Onions, which sounds very odd in English. And his children thought he was completely mad. I mean, just mad, buying all this useless and worthless rubbish. So when he died in 1995, they put up all 500 paintings for sale. They assumed they were just rubbish and will sell them. But just with the chance that some of them might be worth something, they sent them for sale with an auction house in London called Sotheby's. You've heard of Sotheby's? So Sotheby's had a sale of 500 old paintings from this eccentric farmer. And one of them was a painting of young people going a bit wild, a little like English football supporters who have had too much to drink. And they're rampaging around and wrecking buildings. And Sotheby's wrote underneath, "The sack of Carthage." You know, Carthage was a city that was destroyed in the ancient world. School of Pietra da Testa, a minor painter, estimated price £15,000. A great art expert in Britain, Sir Dennis Mann, who's Irish, not Jewish, died recently at 100, I think, was looking through this catalogue, and he sees that one of these football hooligans is carrying away a candelabrum with 7 branches. And he says to himself, that's a menorah. If that's a menorah, they didn't have any menorahs in Carthage. Clearly, this is not a painting of the sack of Carthage. This is a painting of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. In which case, if it's not the sack of Carthage, then the person who painted it was probably not Pietra da Testa. And being a great art expert, he remembered that the great 17th century artist Nicolas Poussin had painted 2 paintings of the destruction of the Second Temple. One of them is today hanging in the Art Museum in Vienna. The other of them was painted in 1626 for a Catholic, Cardinal Barberini, who in 1633 presented it to Cardinal Richelieu. It passed through various hands and had then disappeared from the 18th century. And he realized that this canvas was the missing Poussin. He didn't say anything. He came to the auction, he bid for it. Somebody noticed an art expert is bidding for it, so they started bidding for it. And eventually, instead of going for £15,000, he bought it for £155,000. He then got in touch with the man who got in touch with me, Lord Jacob Rothschild, and said, "Jacob, I have discovered Nicolas Poussin's lost masterpiece, the destruction of the Second Temple." And Jacob Rothschild bought it for £4.5 million. And today it hangs in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And this man's kids thought it was rubbish. And it took Sir Dennis Mann to realize that this is a priceless heritage. And he was much rewarded for that expertise. He earned well over £4 million from that little transaction. Friends, never let us take the risk of letting our children think that what we've left them, their Jewishness, is some old thing piled up in a back room gathering dust, and all they want to do is get rid of it as quickly as possible. Believe me, what we have in our Judaism, our Jewish history, our Jewish way of life, our Jewish heritage, is worth more than Nicolas Poussin's painting of the destruction of the Second Temple. It is truly priceless. Let us bring up our children so that they recognize the value of what we are giving them as their inheritance, and let them display it with pride. Laila Tov, Shalom.